The New York Times calls Noam Chomsky the most important intellectual alive, but as you'll see, Noam Chomsky has much less kind words to say about the New York Times. In fact, he says very few kind things about the American media and the American government in general. The controversial MIT professor has written more than 30 books, many documenting abuses of power and human rights violations committed by the U.S. government. This week, Chomsky published a new book called Hegemony or Survival: America's Quest for Global Domination, and in it he argues how the U.S. government and the U.S. media are complicit in lying to the public about an American imperial strategy. That's his argument. Well, with this in mind, I went down to Boston and I asked Noam Chomsky if he could decode the latest headlines for me and how it feels to be the leading dissident in America. Well, sometimes read your stuff, and we've talked over the years, and they say Chomsky's an anti-American.
That's an interesting concept. Now, suppose somebody in Italy criticizes Berlusconi's policies. Would anybody call him anti-Italian? I mean, try that on the streets of Milan. People collapse in laughter. The idea that someone is an anti-American by criticizing government policies is a strictly totalitarian notion. It's borrowed from the lexicon of totalitarianism. Like in Stalinist Russia, dissidents were called anti-Soviet.
Let me just read you this quotation. There's a Chinook helicopter carrying GIs has crashed inside Iraq. I think there's been 6 soldiers have been killed or more, or 16 soldiers rather. This is from Trent Duffy, the White House spokesman, said, quote, "The terrorists seek to kill coalition forces and innocent Iraqis because they want us to run, but our will and our resolve are unshakable." He uses the term terrorists here. How do you read that?
Well, my friend Charles Glass, an old friend of mine who was ABC Middle East correspondent for many years, read an article about this, which he pointed out that, not quite accurately, that the U.S. must be the only country that describes attacks against occupying military forces as terrorism. Actually, he's not quite right. Most countries do that. Like in occupied Europe, the Nazis described the actions of the partisans as terror. And when they carried out brutal reaction, they called it, in German, terror against terror. The partisans are carrying out terror in occupied Europe.
But we would call it counterterrorism.
We call what we do counterterrorism, just like they did. We call what others, if somebody resists a U.S. military occupation, that's terror. If we use terrorist measures to crush resistance, that's counterterror. And it doesn't matter how wild it is.
You know, in our newsroom, saying the word terrorist is just so controversial that very, very few times in reports you never see it because it inflames passion. Someone says, well, there's a suicide bomber in Israel. Someone says, that's a terrorist action. Says, no, if you call them a terrorist, you have to call the Israeli government a state terrorist. And if you call them a state terrorist, you have to call America, Britain, and France.
Precisely.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So is every country
terrorist?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say every country, maybe Luxembourg isn't, or Andorra, but countries that act, throw their weight around in the international scene, very commonly are involved in terror.
So is the media, in a sense, a part of this and colluding with it? Colluding when they don't use words to describe the U.S. government or the Israeli government or the British government? Say, the terrorist, counterterrorism by the Israeli government against terrorism by someone else?
Okay.
Could they do that?
It's not, and I wouldn't blame the media particularly, because this is just part of the general intellectual culture.
They were carried off one by one for emergency hospital treatment. More than a dozen American soldiers wounded in a war that was supposed to be over 6 months ago.
In a sense, guys like Karl Rove, they're not unhappy when you see helicopters going down and soldiers dying because, and you suggest in the book, it's useful.
I don't say that, you know, I don't think they like it.
You say they don't welcome it, but they know that it can be useful, and so
it's
an opportunity.
They will turn it into an opportunity. They'll try to turn it into an opportunity. And if they have to manufacture a crisis, they'll do that. I mean, take, say, what happened on May 1st of this year. It was very interesting.
It had never happened before. A U.S. president flying onto an aircraft carrier in a Navy jet.
George Bush landed in combat gear on the carefully placed so you get the right television images.
We had a picture yet? Would you like a picture?
Again, any self-respecting newspaper would have collapsed in ridicule. The front page of the New York Times reported that he gave a victory speech with a powerful Reagan-esque finale to the war. What were they referring to? They were referring to Reagan's speech, explaining, proudly how the U.S. is again standing tall after what? After having conquered the nutmeg capital of the world, Grenada, where 6,000 U.S. Special Forces succeeded in overcoming the resistance of a couple of dozen middle-aged construction workers.
In this battle, we have fought for the cause of liberty and for the peace of the world.
In America, when you look at the situation in Iraq, and you have elections coming up, I think a year today, there's another presidential election. And again, I quote again from today's paper, this is the New York Times today. The political challenge posed to President Bush after the deadly helicopter in Iraq, more losses as the losses keep, how to keep public opinion from swinging against him over Iraq while not abandoning his quest to bring a stable democracy to that country.
See, that's straight out of Stalin. That's a free press, if you like.
That's the New York Times
Yeah, and
today.
nobody's forcing them to say that. But they ought to be writhing in embarrassment for saying that. On what grounds do they believe that George Bush is trying to bring a stable democracy to Iraq? The only grounds are our leaders told us that, and we are so subordinate to power that we worship them and revere them, and if they say something, we repeat it, not asking whether it's true. Like, is it true that he's trying to bring a stable democracy to Iraq? Same like they did in Central America, or like they're doing in Uzbekistan, or like they did in the Palestine case that I mentioned, or any other case. You're not allowed to ask that. You have to worship the leader and repeat his phrases as if they are necessarily true, as in the quote you mentioned.
You used to not get a lot of airtime, but now...
Get any airtime.
But now it's different.
Zero.
Now you do.
I'm talking to you. I'm not talking to CBS. Oh, yeah, outside the United States.
New York Times Magazine this past weekend?
That was interesting. Did you look at it?
Yeah.
You take a look at the photograph. It's interesting. They sent a photographer down there, and he did an elaborate photography session, took hundreds of pictures. At the end, a perfectly nice guy, got along fine. At the end of the session, he said, "Would you mind taking your glasses off for some pictures?" And I said, "It's ridiculous. It's not me. I take a picture of Robert Redford or somebody. I never take my glasses off unless I'm going to sleep." She said, "Well, just for fun." What pictures did they use? The ones without the glasses. And it's trivial, but symbolic. The point is, truth is insignificant. It's not even a value.